Hello, Shresh.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. Should we wait a few minutes to let people get on board? I know that for some folks this is going to be an unfamiliar tool, so we should make sure that folks have a chance to get in.
Sounds good.
Hi.
Hey,
Hello.
hey, Felix. Hey, Brad.
So as I asked in chat, which you can access using the little icon at the top left of your screen, is anybody willing to take notes? We need a scribe for the meeting.
I may not be able to stay for the entire time, so I'm probably. I can take notes. Do you put them on the repo or?
Yeah,
Shresh just pasted a link.
the link on the chat. Do you see the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just put in headings in there so you can just start taking notes. Like, and everybody can chime in. So, like, in case like something is missing, feel free to add or edit. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to attribute stuff or just kind of high level notes of what was discussed?
A combination of the two is usually adequate. Like if somebody makes a statement that's impactful or that you feel is important to capture, if you can attribute that, that's great. Because sometimes that matters. But it's not. We don't need a line by line transcript of everything that happens. Which reminds me, should we press the record button? Oh, it is already recorded. Okay.
Oh, it's already recording. Yeah. So Felix, there'll be a recording. So like just do the high level points as well as any action items. Like would be good.
What time is it? Let's wait maybe just 2 more minutes and then we'll get started. And if folks want to help Felix out there, please feel free to do that. It's a CRDT. It's a, what do you call it? Collaborative editing tool. Yeah. And if I fall over asleep halfway through the call, don't worry. It's expected.
Where did you get here, Mark? I just got in today as well.
Saturday evening.
Oh, cool. Okay.
It was a long flight.
Jet lag's killing me too. I landed from JFK via Oslo yesterday afternoon on the red eye, the reddest eye possible.
A bunch of us are in Oslo, so.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I was there for about 3 hours on a layover.
Oh, I had a 9-hour layover in Hong Kong, so that's not fun.
Nice, very nice. Yeah, I was only meant to be in Oslo for 1 hour, but I ended up sitting on the tarmac for an extra 2 hours because they couldn't get takeoff clearance. Yeah, these things, they happen.
Okay, it's going on after 5 minutes after the hour, and it seems like we have a bunch more people who have joined, which is great. Let's go ahead and get started. Just from a super high level, I think our intention in calling this meeting was just to have a kind of a loose discussion and to get people up to date on the status of where we're at. and importantly, to let people give their feedback. I think, you know, in my mind, I'd like the editors to hear people's feedback on the state of the drafts now. If we can discuss the issues, that's great, but I don't think we're going to go issue by issue through the issues list necessarily, although we can talk about a few of them. But just really to update in both directions and make sure that people are aware of where we're at with drafts, and to make sure the editors are hearing from participants about what they think about where we're at and where we're going. And that'll give us a chance to update the drafts probably one more time before the design team meeting in July, and hopefully this will make that meeting that much more productive. And so that's kind of the thinking here. It's not a very formal or structured meeting. I am inclined not to go through and have folks introduce themselves, because I think that will take a fair chunk of time and it's quite awkward with the online interface. But if you do speak, please do introduce yourself very briefly, just so people know where you're coming from. And I guess I should start that. Mark Nottingham, working group chair, and Suresh.
Hey, Suresh Krishnan, also the other working group chair of AIPREF. Good to see some familiar faces as well as new faces. Yeah, so hopefully you have a good meeting today. Thanks.
Great. And the other thing I'll mention is if you're not familiar with this interface, this tool, the Meet Echo, you'll see on the top there's a bar and there's a chat at the left. We might take a poll. There's a show of hands facility next to that. And then on the right, there's a list of the participants that you can look at. And then on the bottom, you have controls for your audio and video, which are separate. You need to toggle them on and off separately if you want to send and receive audio. And there's, most importantly, a queuing function, a hand you'll see with a little slice through it. And that's how we're going to manage the conversation. So if you want to say something when we're discussing something, join the queue and we'll go through the queue, and that keeps the discussion a little more orderly so that we don't have people talking over each other. And also to make sure that everybody has a chance to give their input. So to start, excuse me, we asked Martin to prepare a really brief overview of where the drafts are at. Martin, are you with us? I think I saw your name there. There he is.
Yep.
Do you want to share the slides, Martin? I think you can do that. Yep. Oh, and how do I?
This interface always gets me.
I know, it's...
Okay, so how about this, Martin? I'll share the slides and I'll grant you control, so it's probably easier.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
There we are.
Okay, the
Right,
slides.
so this is very brief.
Oh, sorry, one more thing. If folks, just make sure that while you're not talking, you do mute your microphone. And as long as we don't have performance issues, I think people can leave their cameras on.
Martin, you should have control of the slides.
Excellent. Thanks, Suresh. So this is a brief recap of where we're at. There are two drafts. The first being a vocabulary, and this is the one that Paul and I have been working on for some time. This is the sort of expanded diagram of the different points in the vocabulary. There's some questions about whether these boxes that you see here are inside the TDM envelope or not. I flagged that in some of the issues here, but essentially these are the 5 broad categories of use that we've talked about in the discussions thus far. We have, I think, relatively solid definitions for the AI and generative AI trainings things. There are open issues on those to track the discussion around those definitions and making sure that we're all on board. One of the things that I think we can spend a good amount of time on during the face-to-face time we have the design team meeting will be on discussing those. And then we've added AI inference and search topics relatively recently. Those have not had as much discussion or as much reworking, and we've had some pretty constructive discussion on the search one in particular on the list recently. So you will see pull requests associated with that if you poke at the draft. There are also a number of questions that are open with respect to the sort of hierarchical arrangement that we have here, whereby text and data mining is a superset of AI training in this definition. And if you say yes or no to text and data mining, without saying anything at all about AI training, then AI training will sort of inherit your preference or your what is it, reservation of rights around text and data mining, and so on down to generative AI training, which is, I guess, why we have to resolve the questions about AI inference and search as well. We've had some good discussion on the list about combining and extending the vocabulary in different ways. And there's a little bit more discussion about that one as I go through this one, but there is concrete proposals for what that might look like in the document presently. Those are not final, like all of the things here. We're sketching out a path forward, but obviously there are other choices that we could make. Some of the issues capture those details. And I think that's all there. So I'll move on to the next slide. This is the sort of bridging piece between vocabulary and attachment, is where it turns into bits on the wire. So there's an exemplary syntax, which is essentially, we have an abstract model of how all of these things fit together. And then we have a concrete instantiation of how to make that expression. And there's, again, a proposal in the draft. None of that is particularly final. We're looking for feedback on what's there, obviously. That basically boils down to a label and a yes or no value that's associated with each one of them. Yes being acceptance of use in that category, and no being reservation of rights or withholding of permission to use those things. And again, preferences, as was stated. And I've just noted here on the slide a couple of the ways in which we might extend these things. The first one, the day equal Tuesday, is attached via the semicolon in a very intuitive fashion. HTTP, blame that. But it's attached to the TDM thing. And so you might have TDM equals yes, and some sort of parameter that modifies that. If that's not understood by the person receiving that, then that would be ignored. Then you can extend with new terms potentially in the future. We've talked a little bit about non-commercial use. So I've sketched that one in as an example of a term that would be a category of use, in a sense, one that's orthogonal to the rest of them, so it may be very confusing. I don't propose that we take that on, and we've discussed that previously, that we won't be taking on that, but there it is. And then just arbitrary extensions with the terms of use one. So again, that's all discussed in the vocabulary draft and used in the attachment draft. And we have an issue tracking the sort of pros and cons of each one of the design decisions there. And finally, the attachment draft is relatively straightforward. We take that vocabulary that we've defined and its specific serialization, and we stick it in an HTTP header. And that's one of the attachment methods. And that basically says, if you get an HTTP message that contains content and has this particular header field attached to it, won't get into trailer fields, that applies to that preference applies to that content. Using HTTP terms here, not the ones we have in the draft. That's a separate issue. And then also the same for robots.txt. And that's a little more complicated because of the desire to apply different preferences to different parts of the space that robots.txt governs. And there's, again, a proposal in the draft that carves out one of the potential options in this space. But we have an issue open to track the sort of design space there in a little bit. And we have a couple of other issues around that. Most of those, I would say, would be relatively minor in terms of how we manage how you collect something using crawling or something like that, and then later use it, say 3 or 4 months down the line, which robots.txt applies to that content that you've acquired in the past. And questions like that we'll need to work out and have very clear answers for, so that people understand when they obtain content using HTTP governed by robots.txt, what the expectations are around the use of that content based on the preferences that were expressed. And then finally, there's a question that we have to ask ourselves whether these two methods are the ones that we want to be defining, or whether we want to be talking about other methods of attachment as well. And then that's all I have. And Stefan points out that the figure in the draft is wrong. There's an update to the editor's copy that will cover that.
Great, thank you, Martin. I have to ask, is this image generated by AI?
That one?
Yeah.
You can look it up on the internet.
Okay.
It's a selfie.
Oh, that one.
It's the first non-human selfie. Yeah.
Yes, that actually came up in my copyright class. Fantastic. So if anybody has any feedback, any discussion they'd like to have about any of those issues, really, or any of those points, just queue with the hand at the bottom of the screen, and we'll start working through the queue.
Do you want me to go back to the vocabulary questions first?
Sure, that's a good place to start.
And we can drill down into those issues. The individual issues are important too.
I see the chat is active.
Yep. It's all very constructive.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, maybe speak to that part about it's being discussed in chat, but like also a bit about the vocabulary categories in more specifically. I think what we have in the draft is, and I think Martin said that correctly, like there's some discussions that go further. I think we have like the main things to resolve at the moment, from sort of my feeling of the discussion on the mailing list, are that there some parties have expressed reluctance about having all of these 5 categories in the draft. So there's a bit of a challenge at the very top with regards to the text and data mining category, which we call text and data mining here, but I think the consensus is that we should call it something more neutral, even if the scope of it stays the same. So something like computational analysis or something is what we're leaning to. And I think there is some questions at the bottom of this image with the inference and search categories. It's been suggested that we might want to focus on the training part, which is the AI training and the generative AI training. So that's sort of like, if you want, the horizontal part, which is a little bit on like part of ongoing discussions that we will need to resolve. I think the other thing is that and I look at that more vertically, is essentially the distinction between what we call AI inference here and search. I think Felix has rightly noted that the language in the current draft sort of shows that they are overlapping at the moment. I think the discussion again is going towards defining both of them more narrowly to avoid this overlap. But these are from like, I think from our perspectives, the two sort of directional discussions that are ongoing, and how far do we need this hierarchy, and do we need all these 5 things? And then if we have these last 2 ones, like, we need better distinction, especially between the inference and the search part. And yeah, to the and I think once we have settled all of this, we can redraw this and make it clearer that this is sort of like an hierarchical arrangement where essentially, well, that'll be easy to solve if we solve those other 2 discussions.
Sorry, I was muted. Bradley, go ahead.
Thanks. Not too much more to add to what Paul already said. I think, you know, I agree with his characterization of of the issues and what has been taking up some of the space on the list. I think I was one of the folks that had raised the question of what we call text and data mining. I do think that a neutral label would be helpful, so that we can preserve the hierarchical approach, which I think is helpful because it makes things simple. I think it makes it usable. the idea of being able to kind of to express a preference in relation to all of these uses is something that I think will be very helpful, and I do think that that's a great direction to go in, and then certainly also support the the conversations that have been happening around search and inferences and the distinctions between the two. And it seems to me that there is agreement that the initial, or at least on the list so far, has been agreement that the initial proposal did have some overlapping questions around it, but that as it stands, paring that back seems to have taken a good few positive steps towards addressing that overlap already, not in the draft yet, but is on the list. And so I'm very encouraged by that approach and that progress, and think that those are good reasons to keep having this conversation and refining those preferences, and that they should stay in because they're super important for potential users of these preferences.
Great, thank you, Bradley. Fars.
Hi. So I just don't think that I've been saying it in chat. I just don't think that this figure that we have shows a hierarchy. And I understand, and I have followed the changes that we have made for like TDM and making it specific to automated processing, if I'm not mistaken. And the problem is that we have to take this figure and we have to use a hierarchical figure to show, because this at the moment, as some other people said in chat, it kind of doesn't show hierarchy. And if it's hierarchical, and I'm sorry, like I don't really understand. So we want to define TDM in a very narrow way, and so that it does not, and then also be specific about other functions. But at the moment, if we have this kind of like, what do we mean by hierarchy then? Does it mean that, like, if you say TDM yes and AI no, what sort of function in TDM do we mean that we are saying no to? And sorry if this question is not very clear, but so that's one thing. Another thing that I wanted to mention is about being careful, but not to imply that we are a kind of like, by signaling these preferences, the declarant is establishing any kind of rights, because the declarant could be the rights holder or could not be the rights holder. And we need to, in the document, we need to also clarify that if the declarant is not the rights holder, should be transparent about it, and so that we don't come up with a system that people use in order to, like, establish rights that don't exist. Another point that I had, and I'm sorry, I'm just like gonna get all of them across. And so the other thing is that for RAG and inferences and all those functions, so like, if we want to talk about it in a way that people see, like when they search and they see snippets of like information on search, be it in Chrome or other browsers, like we have to be very careful to like, while the rights holder should be able to ask not to use their materials for those snippets, but we eventually have to think about also the end user and the end user ability to have access to that kind of information in snippets. I'm sorry, I'm not very clear on that. I will send an email to to the mailing list. But I think that what we are missing in our conversation is a strong focus on the end user as well when we are coming up with these preferences. Thank you.
Thanks, Faraz. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd ask people not to fixate too much on the figure. One of the things that we discovered when we had the interim meeting in Brussels was that search is much more complicated than this. It's not just a strict subset of the TDM category. It draws on inference and AI training in order to accomplish its goals, which is why perhaps this particular diagram isn't a great fit for that. What we're trying to show with the diagram is just those categories that are strict subsets of other categories only. And we're not even clear at this point whether or not the two at the bottom are strictly part of TDM as it stands. And that's something that we'll have to resolve through discussion. My understanding from the very broad definition that we have of text and data mining, Paul's computational analysis, if you prefer that name, is that it is extraordinarily broad, and so it would cover these categories, but it would not be the case that for instance, search is a subcategory of AI training. That doesn't make any sense to state that way. And the same for AI inference. Although, as people pointed out during the discussions, AI inference is used in training. I think we have to think about the predominant use of the thing. This is where I think the point that I wanted to make here is what we have right now is definitional, with none of the trimmings that go around those definitions explaining why it is that how things are mapped to each other. And I think there's work for us to do in providing some of the contextualizing that we're having, that are coming out through these discussions, and making it available for people to be able to say, I understand now how this was reasoned about, and the definition says this because it fits together into this grander scheme in the following ways. And part of the problem that we've had coming back to these discussions again and again is that we reiterate the same points over and over. We need to capture those points in the document and sort of explain the rationale that got us to these definitions, not to override the definitions, but to give people a better ability to understand what we've written down. And that's, I think, the next set of work that we're looking to get out once we get the core definitions correct. And I think we're making progress there.
Great, thanks. Paul?
Yes, I wanted to come back to the 3 points that Faraz raised. The first one, like I think Martin also said that, so like I think it's a misreading if you say that we try to make the text and data mining definition narrow. It is broad, right? Like, and we carve out the other things. The other ones are narrow, and text and data mining is sort of what remains if you take the other ones away. And this comes back to the hierarchy question, and I think like it's probably something that makes like we can, if we have these things defined and play through things, hopefully in London, that will emerge somewhat more closely. The second part about your rights holder, I fully get your concern and about the fact that there is sort of like we can't assume that the declaration is made by rights holders and that there's differences in between this. I encourage you to reread again, which we think is relatively stable, the introduction part of the draft that we have right now, which tries to make it very clear that this operates in different legal contexts, that this is independent of a underpinning legal system. And the important design choice here is we're not talking about rights holders. We're talking about declaring parties, which may or may not be rights holders. But you can't even assume in all cases the existence of an entity that is a rights holder. Some stuff will not have any rights associated with it because it's sort of like not original enough, or the rights have expired, certain things. So like the only category that the draft uses as terminology is really that of the declaring party. It may, in many cases, be a rights holder. It may, in many cases, be another party that makes a declaration. That is, in the end, then for the party that receives the information to sort out what kind of consequences this has for them. To your third part about the concerns, like the danger of, especially with the RAG and inference category, that would sort of like infringe on user rights, on user autonomy in using these things. That's also something I think that's very sort of high on our list of concerns. And I think that is why sort of we are leaning at the moment, also based on feedback that we've gotten, towards relatively narrow definition of both the inference and the search category, to make sure that they are not inadvertently sort of like go into a realm where this has sort of consequences for the behavior of individual end users, which is not what we are targeting with this at all, right? Like this should be sort of like, this is in the realm of machines reading things for use in large scale systems. So that's on our list of concerns that is important for us to get right.
Great. And I just wanted to elaborate, at least with my understanding, which I'm happy to have corrected. But you know, when I think about the hierarchical nature and the role of text and data mining, it's almost, if you can think back to before AI training was an understood use case, text and data mining is that kind of category that, you know, would encompass that future use case. It's kind of the catch-all category. And having that hierarchy is useful for that, so that if other unknown uses of data come along down the road, you know, they're captured by that effective default that text and data mining represents. At least that's how I conceptualize it. I'd be interested to hear if folks disagree with that conceptualization. And go ahead, Felix.
Yeah, I think in terms of structure, it's probably easier to nail down the definitions and names of the categories first, and then describe the hierarchy, because especially if you're looking at the question, is inference included in text and data mining? This question probably wouldn't pose itself if we just agreed that we have an overarching category and give it a generic name that signifies that it is essentially all uses that the preferences could refer to. So maybe something like computational analysis. But also for the AI inference and search categories, I mean, we already had some discussions on the mailing list that showed that even though these names appear to be kind of intuitive, people mean different things even when they say search. So I think maybe a useful way of addressing that problem would be to figure out, or start from, what is it that users of this vocabulary want to make specific statements about, and then kind of work back from there. And it seems to be that what users care about in the AI inference space and in the search space is essentially how the information is shown to the user. So if it is a list of search results that are basically taken one-on-one from the original or the asset that is being found, people tend to classify it as search. But if it is in some way altered or summarized or something like that, people tend to put it in the inference bucket. But quite often AI is used in both cases. So I don't know how exactly we could narrow this down. I started off from this perspective of saying one is about indexing and one is about sort of modifying the search results based on the request. But also thanks to Gary's quite useful presentation about sort of the different ways where AI is used in Google search, it doesn't seem to be quite so simple, or it's not a clear line to be drawn. So I just wanted to flag that, that, yeah, maybe if we can't say search without AI and search with AI, that instead we should talk about how the information is presented to the user.
Thanks, Felix.
Okay.
Leonard?
Leonard, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted, there seems to be some confusion about inference and what it is or isn't. And at least I wanted to, since I'm one of the biggest, if not the biggest proponent around the inference category, I thought it would be worth sort of setting some context for that, for those who haven't been part of the conversations to date. So the history of that term, and more specifically the use case that goes around it, is what is sometimes known as style reference or just generally referencing. So the idea where the user has an AI application running, they can add one or more sources or references to go along with their prompt, and say something in the prompt that is referenced to the sources, like make it in style or something to that effect. So it does not impact training. The asset is not stored or maintained in any way by the system. It is purely used at the time of inference. And that's why it differentiates from training, and why, if you look at the definition, and this was quoted by Brendan in chat, we specifically call out this has nothing to do with training. It is purely something that happens later, and that's why it's in its own box in that diagram and lives separately. So I just wanted to, call that out and give the use case that we always talk about. So thanks.
Great. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to one thing. Like, I think what I find interesting also in all of this discussion is that essentially these categories that we disagree about or there's different interpretations about the contours, have stayed stable since we started discussing them in Brussels, right? Like, no one suggested something totally different, like another category that's useful, or try to reshuffle this completely. So I think for me at least, this points to, like, we're on the right path here, and we need to get sort of like the boundaries and the differences right. But I have yet to see someone on the mailing list or elsewhere sort of fundamentally challenge this approach that we have, which gives me some confidence that sort of like with a bit of more sort of tweaking, wordsmithing, understanding what we're saying, and certainly what people are saying here in this room is very useful for that, we can get to a stable understanding of these.
Okay, Timid Robot.
I just wanted to re-emphasize the kind of the how versus what delineation that Martin made in the mailing list. I think that focusing on the what of these categories instead of the how of the categories increases their specificity and removes a lot of the overlap, in my opinion. Thank you.
Great. Stefan.
I suggest that we go back on why do we need a hierarchy. Since we are writing normative documents, we should design a hierarchy only if it will be used for something. For instance, if there is a broad category, text and data mining, it's useful only if you can opt out from everything just with TDM no. Otherwise, if categories are here without practical consequences for the vocabulary, for the semantics of the language, I believe that they are useless. I think it is more or less what Mirja Kulvind said in the chat, that we need, before discussing hierarchy, we should discuss on what will be the practical consequences of this hierarchy.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. So, Pars, I think like one direction you might go is like take a look at text in like 4.1 and see if there's any changes you want in there, right? And start the discussion based on that. Because like I think like following up on like what Mark was saying, right? It's fairly broad, but it's like clearly written down. So if you think there's something that could change there, I think that could be a good direction to start. And Mirya and Stefan, I think like one of the ideas of having this kind of catch-all container is to make sure that like, we don't opt into something that we don't know about at some point, right? So the general thing is like you'd like do a blanket no to start off with, and then like, turn on the things that you actually are opting into, right? So I think that's the value of it. So if you don't see an use for that, like then you probably can explain like how somebody would go about doing it, right? Imagine I just want to enable this for AI inference, but for nothing else, right? How do we say nothing else? Because like if you don't have a catch-all, then it means that you're expecting a specific kind of regime that's sitting outside, right? So I think that's kind of what we're trying to avoid.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, like to some degree, like I think it feels like we don't have full alignment on what hierarchy means. Like there's always this question, sort of like the important thing with the hierarchy of the different categories is that we will also have a principle that a more specific preference overrides, like in the lowest possible, like in the hierarchy, the lowest possible thing will always override the higher one. So you can indeed, like as someone just pointed in the chat, say no to text and data mining and yes to generative AI training. And that means like you're also, as a result, making a statement about all the other categories on here. So there is actually, like I think what Stefan described, there is a functional requirement that makes it sort of like that requires this thing. Another one, non-functional requirement, but honestly also important one, at least from my particular view, is that we know that there is a large number of right holders or potential declaring parties in Europe who want to express who want to use this vocabulary in order to exercise their rights under the copyright directive, right? And if we're not giving them a category that broadly corresponds with the concept of text and data mining as defined in the European law, these people will need to come up and define their own overarching category, and that would potentially undermine the overall objective that we're having here to build one system that sort of like can express the complete sort of richness of this space. Like if we're not having the text and data mining equivalent in our system, it's very likely that entities operating in Europe will need to look at our system and some other system that also has such a category, and that is probably not desirable from the perspective of most of the participants in this discussion.
Well, the queue is empty, but there's still active discussion in chat. And we've been focusing mostly on issue 5. Timid Robot.
I would very much appreciate having a top level category, a super category that would define the default for all preferences, that it would contain all preferences. Whether we call it TDM or some other synonym of TDM is not important to me. I don't think we should call it default though, because we are working within the context of machine use. Thank you.
Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, it seems like we are rehashing the same old arguments about TDM again and again and again, and I'll try to be patient. The discussion that we had at the face-to-face IETF meeting was, I thought, very incisive. I think it was Richard Barnes who said there are really 3 states here: yes, no, and not saying anything. And the not saying anything is the current state of everything in the world, modulo all of the attempts to do TDM reservations and various other things like that may be able to be sort of massaged into this framework. But without the ability to say that I don't know, we don't have a coherent model for this thing. And we need to be able to have people say, I'm not expressing a preference on something like this. Having a broad category like all or TDM, I'm starting to like all more, the more that we talk about it now, gives you the ability to say, look, everything is out, unless I say otherwise. And that's the structure that we currently have in the document. And I think that's a really important thing for people to be able to say, is say, I would like to be able to say something about all of these uses, maybe some of the ones that I haven't anticipated yet, that might be defined under this this broad category that we're defining, and then say, but I do value, for instance, search. I've heard this a number of times. People value search a lot, and they want to be able to say yes to search, but then no to things that they don't understand. And having that ability is really important. So I think what we have achieves that. I think there's some definitional things, and I think getting a tiny step removed from the EU definitions is a good thing. Unfortunately, I think the definitions in EU law are very, very good and roughly correspond to exactly what we want to have. So I want to make sure that we don't go too far away from that one. But the discussion in chat that's sort of focusing on all forms of machine processing is, I think, the direction that I think we need to be heading here. Recognizing that when someone deliberately chooses to ignore preferences, whether it be because they're driving one of these inference engines in the referencing thing that Leonard talked about, or something like that, they're responsible for overriding the preferences, and we need to be able to make some very clear statements about that as well. I think it might be worthwhile me opening an issue to talk about that use case of having someone deliberately override the preferences and acknowledge that in the document, because we don't do that right now, and that's one of the pieces of context that I think we probably need.
Yeah, we did talk about kind of that setting expectations function that we need to have fulfill. Suresh.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So I think one more thing that kind of was very interesting to me in having this TDM thing is that it kind of gives some determinism in presence of different kind of regimes, right? So if I have TDM equal to no and search equal to yes, right? Like, so just taking Miria's example, right? If I just say search equal to yes, like that could be treated differently in an opt-in regime and an opt-out regime, right? And if I say like TDM equal to no and search equal to yes, like whether it's an opt-in regime or opt-out regime, like it would be treated consistently. I think that is like a key advantage for me having that. So I just want to throw that up there, Miria, in case that changes your mind.
Okay, we're about halfway, a bit more than halfway through the call. And we've been focusing mostly on kind of this TDM definition and especially hierarchy. So issues 3 and 5. Do we want to look at any of the other issues about vocabulary before we look at attachment? Perhaps search and inference, especially since they're relatively new. Felix.
Yeah, so I worry that the name inference talks about two different things. And what Leonard has explained about sort of the genesis of this category points towards that problem. And I am fine with having a category that talks about the behavior of an AI system. So if somebody prompts an AI system and the AI system goes out and independently fetches resources from the web, it makes perfect sense to me that this vocabulary should communicate preferences to the provider of that AI system not to use certain assets. But what we also call inference sometimes is when a user puts something into a prompt window, which is something that should be, in my opinion, entirely invisible for the purpose of the vocabulary, because it goes into questions of privacy, of users' fundamental rights that the provider of an AI system should not be able to override. And I fear if we just call this category inference, when really what we mean is more closely something like RAG, then we're creating a possibility, at least, that some AI system providers will use the preference signals, even though they are voluntary, to restrict what users can do. And the end user will have no recourse against that. So for example, let's say somebody has said inference no, and an AI system provider then prevents users from being able to include that asset as a prompt, then they're restricting what the end user can do, even though the end user might actually have the right to do that. So it kind of goes into the direction of technical protection measures. And so that's why I think it's really important that we define these categories in a way that they address the behaviors of AI systems, but not the behaviors of humans.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, I think that is something that sort of we put on purpose, put out a relatively broad inference category, right? Like that that covered everything, knowing a bit this discussion. And I think the feedback and the concerns show us that we need to narrow this down. And at some point, when you narrow this down, you also can't call the category inference anymore, because inference is basically sort of in the end when the AI model system is deployed, right? Like it's a very broad thing. There's very many different types of inference that are taking place. And I think the one scenario that we understand most of the people who are asking for a category that applies at this thing is sort of like what's generally called RAG. So where the system goes out, fetches something, and uses that as input for the operation of the system. I think that applies to the scenarios that we've heard from some of the people in the publishing community, where it is about summaries or translations. This applies to, like, I think the style reference stuff that no, it doesn't. Bad example. I see you shaking. I don't want to disagree with you, but RAG is a more specific type of inference, and so like I think if we're narrowing down in that direction, at some point that the term inference for this category becomes misleading. So we probably need a better term there, and we need to narrow this down to some degree, especially around the lines that Felix and I think Fars earlier had indicated become problematic when they interface with like individual user sites.
Leonard.
Yeah, so I'm totally fine if we rename inference. And I do agree with Felix and Paul that, you know, splitting it up into RAG and Brendan used the term prompt time, whatever we call them, I think are perfectly reasonable. But I will say that the history of this predates RAG, and that the use case is indeed much more around asset-based identifiers rather than location-based, meaning that regardless of where a given asset is retrieved from, you know, it has that embedded AI control specification. And yes, if a user says you cannot use me as a style reference, and I gave in the repo in the issue, you know, the Studio Ghibli example, and we've discussed this before. And again, this is regime agnostic, but if an author wishes to express a preference that they don't wish their style, their assets, whatever, to be reused in that type of scenario, they should be able to express that preference. Like that, whether or not how the AI system handles it, how it relates to, you know, regimes, we've agreed that's out of scope, but there needs to be a way for the author to state that preference and incorporate it into the assets that they produce. And I don't care what we call
it. Timid Robot.
Hi, I'm Timid Robot. Yeah, I got on here to say a very similar thing. I think the example that Felix gave was a UX problem, not a AI preferences problem. And I would also like to stress the preference portion of AI preferences. There is a tremendous amount of use that will happen regardless of or irrespective of the AI preferences. I know in Europe there's a bunch of exceptions under TDM, for example, for research and whatnot. And so I don't, we're not designing an access control mechanism. As Leonard said, we're designing a system for giving users the ability to state the preference, or content holders to state a preference. Thank you.
Thank you. Felix?
Even though the vocabulary is intended to express preferences, I think we have to be conscious of how it might be used in practice. And if we have a TDM category and EU law says that you may use assets for text and data mining as a commercial entity, unless the right holder has expressed an opt-out, it's reasonable to think that AI companies that want to avoid any liability under EU copyright law will treat a TDM equals no signal as an opt-out. In that case, the AI company, as a commercial entity that is trying to make use of that particular copyright exception, might have little other choice than to follow TDM equals no. But the user that is using an AI system provided by that AI company might be relying on an entirely different copyright exception. For example, the private copying exception, or the research exception, or whatever it may be. Or they might be a non-commercial research entity that has its own text and data mining exception where the opt-out doesn't apply. And the problem that I'm trying to point out is, if there is an intermediary in the stage that treats the voluntary preference signal of TDM equals no as a legal directive, then anyone using their system would also be restricted technologically from doing something that they're allowed to do. And I think we have to be aware of this mechanism. And so I don't think it's purely a UX question, because the incentives of the companies will just be to restrict those users to shield themselves from liability.
I don't think you're wrong, Felix, but I think that's out of our scope. I think that's where the excuse me, I think that's where the market will come into play. Vote with your checkbook. In other words, if an AI company builds a system that can't be used by some entity, they will go elsewhere. I mean, that's what we do as a business. That's what we the industry has done.
Leonard, you're breaking up.
I've got my features, you get your features. Do it. Pick one that makes the most sense for you. But that's out of our control. We're saying, here's the technical means to express preferences. Here's the way that you then evaluate those preferences. Make and do it in whatever legal way your lawyers tell you to do.
Yeah, I got in queue to agree with Leonard there, speaking personally. I think what I'd like to see is us to be more explicit about that in what we document, and to highlight these perhaps less obvious effects, so that policymakers and others can understand the potential outcomes that might come up here. Paul.
I think I'm somewhere in between both, right? Like we sort of, I think Leonard is right about these being preferences, and sort of like, I think it is out of our scope to also fully control how these preferences are implemented. People can implement them in a more stringent, and corporations will maybe want to implement them in a more stringent way than absolutely necessary. We don't have much effect on that. But I would still argue it's important for us to get the definition of these categories right, so that we limit the amount of unintended like I would consider like limiting user rights a form of harm. People may disagree, but like limit the amount of unintended consequences of expressing a preference is sort of like should be a design principle for us. And yeah, so I find that holds somewhere between what Felix is arguing for and what Leonard is arguing for.
Suresh.
Yeah, so I think like Felix, to your point, right? There's like one thing that we probably haven't dug into very much. I'm not sure if we should. Is that like are these things carried forward, right? Like Tom, like when you're talking about common crawl, right? Like how far do these things go further? Because if somebody's training an AI model, then the user of the AI model, like do they know all the things that went into that model and do they get passed along? I don't think we've addressed that at all. And I'm not sure if it's something we should address, like given the timeline we are in, but would you at least just like me to throw up an issue, Martin, like just to put it in there so that we thought about it and we didn't do it?
So I think that's probably out of scope for us right now. It's a little difficult to imagine, but for the most part, if someone's building a model, we have a rule we have a category of use for that one, and that covers that. It doesn't necessarily extend beyond that point. So most of these categories exist at the point that the content is consumed in some way or used in some way, and that's it. The obligation ends at that point. We've deliberately avoided having anything that attaches to the model and then goes downstream of that model in its use. And I think that's deliberate, and that's a good design choice.
Yep, makes sense. No, I just want to make sure that it's documented somewhere. So if somebody brings up the point, we can point to it as, hey, we discussed this and we like decided not to address it, so we can point to something.
Yeah, and Tom points out the difference between consumption of information and crawling. Crawling is about the acquisition of it. We're talking about the use of it. That's an important distinction to make.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to make that point as well, and I think there is one issue I think related to the attachment draft though, like that is about like where does it apply at use or at assumption. So like I think this part in the where in time does it apply from between crawling and use, like I think that we need to solve. I think that is in scope, but like this sort of after the first use, like I think we are giving instructions for people who obtain the asset and then use the asset, and the scope of what we're defining here ends right there. Like otherwise, like I think we're in sort of like totally uncharted territory for this group as well.
Speaking of attachment, should we flip over and take a look at that for a little while? So Martin, yeah, you probably want to talk about the issue that you want to talk about. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that Brendan may have disappeared already, which would be unfortunate, but he makes a good point in chat here. There is a third leg to the attachment thing. He talked about the embedded metadata and the IPTC work, and there's a bunch of other pieces of work that are going on in this area. I think it's very important for those things to exist. They will provide a supplement to what it is that we're doing. The only challenge is that as the IETF, the number of container formats and formats to which we can apply this thing is relatively limited, and our ability to hit a broad scope of things is much less when we start to talk about specific formats. And so it may just be that once we do our initial delivery of things, the next phase of this involves going out and finding those formats that the IETF is involved with, and then liaising with folks like IPTC to sort of align the work that they're doing with the definitions that we have here, so that we can say definitively, this means the same as this, even though it's spelt differently in this particular format, and this particular format has these other ones, and maybe this format takes the syntax that we defined directly across, and all of those sorts of things come second, because there's there's a great number of formats that we'd have to address to get good coverage. What we're doing here is sort of setting up a baseline.
Leonard.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in agreement on that, and the plan has been, and with respect to IPTC, C2PA, et cetera, is that this will be the defined vocabulary, the terminology, and that will adjust all of the existing embedding attachment approaches to mirror this once this is standardized. So we're absolutely all in alignment that that's the intent. And I think that's why sometimes, there's pushback on some of these, the definitions are such in the document being written, is to make sure they can all be aligned and syntactically they make sense and whatnot. So, but directionally, I think we are all absolutely aligned and have been.
Yes, and that was honestly sort of also the intent of us submitting this draft to the IETF process in the first place, not only to have coherence within the IETF cosmos, but like to have this ability to coordinate across others. And I personally I think it's really great news that Brendan says that IPTC is also in principle looking at this, because like they were one of the people who I think weren't really directly involved at the beginning, and sort of it's from my perspective, it's really good to see sort of people informally agreeing on that maybe this process is in the lead and willing to coordinate with us. That also puts like some responsibility on our shoulders to make sure that this also works in the wider world of what we call asset-based attachment mechanisms. I think we're doing a good job here.
Brian.
Is my audio working?
Yep.
I'm quite interested in these alternative attachments as well and embedding. I mostly held off because I think that we should probably wait. Like I assume that we're kind of waiting for this first phase of kind of like staying focused on this work. But I do wonder, we've done a good job specifying this kind of string encoding of preferences that we can use in HTTP headers, we can use in these various attachment things. I assume we want to just keep things as simple as possible, but I wonder if maybe a like simple JSON kind of like key value encoding would be helpful and could help guide these other attachment points, or if we should really even hold off on that.
My inclination would be that if you want to maybe start another draft or have a side conversation, that would help kind of explore that space, as long as everyone's clear that we're not going to spend significant working group time focusing on progressing that. But in terms of proving that the framework that we're coming up with is usable in those other and drawing out any issues that might happen, I think that would be quite valuable. That's my initial reaction.
Yeah, and Brian, that's yeah. I mean, seems perfectly reasonable. As I said, I think with Brendan representing the IPTC and their syntax, myself representing C2PA, JPEG Trust, and some of the other groups. We have Sebastian, and I mean many of the other pre-existing attachment folks are represented. So I think we're keeping that, we're making sure it aligns. But yeah, if you think that there's a use case for putting together something more formal, I think we'd be happy to work with you on it.
Yeah, and Leonard, as part of that, would you be willing to kind of collect these things on the side, like where are the set of people we go to? We put something in the charter, but like, if you can collect a list of people who need to get this, so when we are at the right level of maturity, we can kick off the process, like with Mark and I can kick it off, and like Mike and Miria are on the call as well, so like we can figure out like how to get these things out.
100%. In fact, I am on behalf of the ISO, IEC, and ITU. I actually maintain such a list, so I will share it with the group shortly.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other attachment discussion? So we've got, what, about 20 minutes left. I wanted to ask specifically all of the editors, do you have any other questions or any kind of things you'd like to bring up that will help you progress the drafts between now and London? And is there anything else you need from the group?
Can we do, since it's on the screen and I know there's a little bit of debate in the mailing list, can we do 51 or at least talk about it for a little bit? Martin, using the question of whether or not to do it as a structured field seemed to be, if we could decide that would make some good changes to the spec in preference to London.
Sure. No, let's talk about that, and then editors, if you can keep that question in the back of your mind for the end of the call. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would like to be able to seal the deal on that very last question on the slide. Here, I think it's one of the more basic ones. I think we did just discuss that, and I think broadly we are concluding that yes, this is the right set of things that we're doing right now, and we're not looking to expand the scope in the short term, but that we may do so in the long term. That would be a really nice thing to put a button in. The question of syntax, as Leonard raised, I've raised. So the draft has a proposal in there. Leonard raised some alternatives. I think that, and unfortunately Fabrice is not with us right now. Fabrice had another alternative as well. And I think that there's some interesting trade-offs that come with each of those alternatives. Most relevant, I think, is the question of extensibility to both of those. So one of the points that I think a number of people raised was they wanted to be able to have the ability to attach additional information to each one of the individual preferences that are expressed. So if you say, I'm not okay with someone using this asset for AI training purposes, you might want to be able to say, oh, here's a URL that you can go to the terms of use, that if you comply with that, just ignore whatever it is that I've said here. This is the sort of, I'm reserving my rights, but then I've got a more sophisticated and complete document that describes the set of conditions under which you are able to use that. And so that's one of the examples that have come up throughout this. And I think it's a reasonable one to have. I don't think we need to build it into the first version of it, but to be able to have that ability is, I think, critical. Now, the question is whether that statement's attached to the entire expression of preferences or individual pieces of it is something that we have to resolve. But one of the things that the current form has the ability to do is do it either. You can attach extensions to individual pieces or to the entire thing. And that's something that I think we lose with some of the alternative designs around 51. And I wanted to sort of highlight that as a potential trade-off that we need to keep in mind when designing these things.
I'm a little, I can raise my hand, but I'm a little confused, Martin. For 51, I thought the only question there was whether or not is where you specify the path is above, in other words, outside the usage or inside the usage. And maybe I misunderstood. I don't see why where you put it impacts any of those other issues. That in both cases, you can extend, we have full extensibility, we have all of those other things. I think it's purely syntactical, not technical or in any way. Am I missing something?
Yeah, we probably need a whiteboard for this one. But the example that I saw that someone used based on your proposal was you would have path equal foo.
Right.
And then for that path, you would have parameters attached to that pair of values. So there would be a root, which is the path being a specific path prefix. And then attached to that, you would have the various preferences for that path.
Correct.
And in doing so, you're attaching parameters to that. And there's only one level of parameters in the syntax that we're using. We wouldn't be able to then say, for this path and for this particular preference, there are further parameters associated with AI equal no. You'd lose the second order of parameterization on that one.
Oh, so you're okay. So if I understand the way you're saying it, because I've got the path up front, then I can say AI no, details foo, details over here, EDM no, yes, details over here. I see why. Okay, interesting. All right, let me go back and think about that. Now I understand it, and I'm with you. Let me think about that one. Thank you.
It's not a big deal. The other consideration that I have here, I think, is I find what I have on screen a lot easier to think about and type. You just type a path in, and then you hit space, and then you put down your preferences. It's user-centric. And I think one of the responsibilities that we have here is to the people who are writing these files to make sure that it's easy for them to be able to author them. And that's, I think, one of the things that drove that design over some of the previous ones that we had. And then the final consideration, I think that's really important in talking through this particular issue, is the backwards compatibility one. The first version of the draft had a design in it that had multiple of these groupings throughout. And Fabrice rightly pointed out that existing robots text processors look for the star group or their group and nothing else. And if they see their group, they ignore the star group. It's pretty straightforward. If you put multiple groups in and you have to decide between which group applies, then it's complicated and they will probably break. And I think that's a very astute observation, and we try to keep this down to exactly one group. His spelling loses all extensibility along the axes that we're talking about, so that's part of the reason why I think that one's a little bit awkward. But again, there's a bunch of trade-offs here.
Sonia.
Thanks. I haven't followed the attachment as closely as the vocabulary, but are we also considering the hierarchy and conflicting designations or instructions, if you like? Because I think the attachment then has implications. So, for example, if you have no TDM or no computational analysis at the robots.txt level, then you're not going to be able to get to the other attachment mechanisms that might be at a lower level.
Yeah, so this is an important point that I've repeated a few times, and I think it's worth repeating. Robots.txt has a function which governs whether you can obtain something, and that's the allow-disallow rules. None of the stuff that we're defining will change any of that. So this is the acquisition of content, and that's already defined in robots.txt. If you are allowed to obtain something, and robots.txt has rules for it, then you can still go off and get it, and you may then be exposed to the other forms of attachment as a result. And the combining discussion that we haven't had yet will have to deal with that question. It says, I've encountered a set of rules that are in robots.txt. I've encountered HTTP headers, and I've encountered embedded metadata in the content itself. How do I combine all of those into a single coherent set of rules? Do I just pick this one at the exclusion of the others, or are there multiple entities that are potentially expressing preferences that all need to be respected? And that's a discussion that we have not concluded yet.
Timid Robot.
Yeah, my confusion on the list was about that kind of crawl versus usage, and I would like our documentation to be clearer about the fact that the preference that we're not trying to get to a single like a single phase kind of access, but there's like two levels of access. There's crawling, whether they have the whether an entity has content at all, and then the preferences attach to whatever content they have that's been defined for. And I'll do my best to help out as much as I can with that wording. Thank you.
Leonard.
Yeah, so I'm a little confused that issue 12 is not what you've described it to be, because I went to go look at it. Issue 12, at least as it's written, seems to be more about what happened. I mean, it sort of gets at it, but maybe it also goes into a different direction. So there's also a question about what happens if the site doesn't exist anymore, that you collected it from. So there's a difference between preferences for time of collection and preferences for time of use. That's one issue. There's a separate issue, which is what happens if you have a set of preferences and they're potentially no longer valid for some undefined definition of valid. So 12 at the moment covers both cases. Maybe we should split 12 because they're both very important topics, but different. Yeah, we could. I don't care one way or the other, Martin, but they are separate topics to be discussed.
Martin, sorry, Paul.
Yeah, I just want to note that I think that part that Martin highlighted, that this is sort of like that there's a obtaining layer and then a use layer, is something that we will need to explain extremely well to sort of declaring parties, because like I think a lot of declaring parties at the moment look at the log files and see that some crawler has been there and then make all kinds of assumptions, like equate the presence of the crawler towards lots of behavior that may or may not have happened subsequently. And I think sort of like this will require some educational effort, that the fact that a set of resources has been crawled despite there being a usage preference that said don't use it for this, does not automatically indicate that the usage preference has been violated. That is sort of like, I think that goes probably in the applicability statement or somewhere, but I foresee that to cause significant potential for misunderstanding on the side of people using these preference signals.
Okay, got less than 10 minutes left. I'll return to the question I asked earlier. Editors, do you feel like you need anything else from the group to make some progress before the London meeting? Anything else you'd like to ask about? I'm seeing a shaking head.
This has all
Sorry,
been
do you
pretty
shake head?
constructive.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So for that London meeting, we really need to use that time effectively. So just ask folks again, please keep up to date with the mailing list. Please keep up to date with the drafts. If we do manage to get another set of drafts out before that meeting, please make sure you read them carefully. If you have comments on them, send them to the mailing list before the meeting. That's we can start those discussions. We don't have to hold off to the meeting to at least kick those off. But what we really want to do is in the very near future, as we progress through this process, we need to make sure that we have all the issues exposed and considered by the group. If we're discovering big issues late in the process, that's not good. So if you've been holding off, if there's something you need to discuss, please get it in front of the group very soon, because we're getting to that stage where we need to start really nailing down all the issues and so we can ship our products on the schedule that we want to. The other thing I wanted to bring up, there is, I don't know how many people are planning to go to the Madrid meeting, but there's an opportunity to have a hackathon there where we have people working together to ship some code or tests around this. And one of the things we could do is ship something to parse and show, validate a set of preferences and show how they might be applied. If folks are interested in that, we can start a discussion in the mailing list about participating in that. Anything else we need to cover?
No, I think the one thing is like, since we have a meeting in Madrid, there's going to be more people who'll join, like rather than the core set of people. So I think we need to get our ducks in a row to make sure that we kind of like engage constructively with the rest of the community who doesn't participate that intensely, I think.
Yeah.
So I think like we should probably like try to have a document trail on things we talked about, so we don't have to waste time on that, I think.
Yeah. And especially, I think there are still portions of our discussions that are shared understandings between the people who have been active, but we haven't written them down in great detail yet. And we need to start writing those things down so that the questions that keep on coming up can be answered by saying, well, go look at section 4.7 or whatever it is. And, rather than having to keep this oral tradition up. And I do see some interest in the hackathon, which is great. Oh, great. Okay. Well, unless we have anything else that we'd like to discuss now, we've got 5 minutes left, and I'd be more than happy to go collapse in a puddle of jet lag right now. Anybody? Any last words?
Thanks, Felix, for taking the note. Like, it's never easy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and so hopefully we'll see at least some of you, if not most of you, in London in a couple of weeks, either in person or online. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. See you.
Thank you.
Thanks.